Sam Black Church Cemetery sits quiet in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Locals lock their doors before sunset, and most won't say why. A single grave holds the answer. Zona Hester Shue died in 1897, and her death became the only U.S. murder case decided partly on ghost testimony. 10 cemeteries across Appalachia carry stories like hers. Unmarked plots, sealed records, and warnings passed down for generations. Tonight we walk through every one. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Stay close, because the strangest sight on this list doesn't even have a name. Number 2. Cemeteries 1 and 2. Snow covered the ground the morning a young boy found Zona Hester Shue dead in her home. It was January 1897, and her husband, Edward Trout Shue, said she'd suffered a fall down the stairs. The local doctor barely examined the body. He noted bruising around her neck, but moved on fast, ruling her death natural. Something about that visit felt rushed even to those who witnessed it. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, never believed the ruling. She prayed for answers every night for weeks. Then, according to her sworn testimony, Zona's spirit appeared to her 4 separate times. The ghost described exactly how Trout Shue had broken her neck. Picture yourself standing in that farmhouse kitchen at midnight, watching a grieving mother recount conversations with the dead, conversations detailed enough to convince a courtroom. Mary Jane pushed for an exhumation. When investigators finally opened the coffin, they found Zona's neck broken and her windpipe crushed. Trout Shue was arrested within days. At trial, defense attorneys tried to dismiss the ghost story as grief-driven fantasy. It didn't work. Cross-examination of Mary Jane's account actually exposed holes in Shue's alibi, holes nobody had noticed before. He was convicted of murder and sent to the state penitentiary, where he died 3 years later. To this day, Greenbrier County holds the only recorded case in American legal history where testimony about a ghost helped secure a conviction. Zona rests now at Sam Black Church Cemetery, just off Route 60. But her grave isn't the only one drawing questions here. Walk 20 yards past her headstone and the rows change completely. Older graves sink into the earth, unmarked and forgotten. Some date back to the church's founding in 1817. No records list who's buried beneath most of them. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted decades later revealed dozens of burial depressions with no stones at all. More bodies than the official church registry ever accounted for. Caretakers who've worked the grounds for years won't walk that back section after dark. One told a local reporter he'd rather reroute his entire mowing schedule than cross it at dusk. He never gave a clear reason why. No one has identified who's buried in those unmarked rows. And that absence of an answer is exactly what waits for us next. Because the deeper we go into these mountains, the more graveyards we find where the dead outnumber the names on record. Number 3. Cemeteries 3 and 4. That pattern repeats across the region more than most people realize. Before we go further, hit subscribe if forgotten places like this pull you in. It helps this channel keep digging up stories most people have never heard. Now picture a small family plot near Adams, Tennessee, tucked behind fields that still get farmed today. This is Bell Family Ground, tied to one of America's oldest documented hauntings. Between 1817 and 1821, the Bell family reported a presence in their home so aggressive it spoke through objects and allegedly caused physical harm to family members. Even Andrew Jackson, according to local accounts, visited the property and left shaken by what he witnessed. The entity called itself a spirit disturbed from its resting place. No record ever confirmed whose grave it claimed to be. What researchers do know is stranger. Visitors to the Bell Cemetery today report cameras that stop working the moment they cross into the plot's boundary. Phone batteries drain within minutes. A local paranormal research group documented 17 separate equipment failures at that exact location between 2015 and 2022, all within the same 40-foot radius. Skeptics point to old power lines running nearby, but surveyors confirm there's no electrical infrastructure within half a mile of the site. That explanation doesn't hold up, and nobody's offered a better one. Imagine standing at the edge of that plot as the sun drops behind the ridge. Your phone shows 80% battery when you arrive. 10 minutes later, it's dead, and you never touched it once. A short walk from the main Bell plot sits a second, smaller cemetery, one most tourist maps leave off entirely. Locals call it the empty ground. Fewer than a dozen stones remain standing, and several bear no names, just carved symbols nobody's fully translated. Historians believe it may predate the Bell family's arrival in the area by decades, possibly linked to earlier settlers whose records burned in a courthouse fire in 1875. That fire destroyed nearly every land and death record for the county. Whatever happened to the people buried in the empty ground? The paper trail that could explain it is gone completely, which raises an uncomfortable question we'll need to answer soon. How many other Appalachian cemeteries lost their history the exact same way, in the exact same kind of convenient blaze? Number 4, Cemeteries 5, Blair Mountain, peak value. That question about convenient fires has an answer, and it leads straight to the biggest cemetery mystery in Appalachian history. Logan County, West Virginia, August 1921. Roughly 10,000 coal miners marched toward Blair Mountain armed with rifles, determined to unionize despite company gunmen and local sheriffs standing in their way. It became the largest armed labor uprising in American history, second only to the Civil War in scale of combat on U.S. soil. Machine guns, private planes, and even bombs were used against American miners on American ground. Official death tolls list somewhere between 50 and 100 casualties. Historians who've spent decades studying the battle believe the real number runs much higher. Coal companies controlled the land, controlled local government, and controlled which deaths got recorded at all. Miners killed in the fighting were often buried quickly, quietly, and without headstones, sometimes in mass graves dug by their own surviving comrades. Stand for a moment on that ridgeline today. Trees have reclaimed most of the battlefield. Rusted shell casings still surface after heavy rain, buried just inches below the soil. Somewhere beneath your boots, men who fought for basic labor rights lie in ground that was never properly marked, never properly counted, and never fully investigated. Here's what makes this different from every other cemetery on this list. This is an ancient history buried under decades of confusion. Mining companies still own large sections of Blair Mountain today. Full archaeological excavation has been blocked repeatedly, tied up in land disputes and permitting fights that stretch back years. Preservationists have fought since the 1990s just to get the site listed on the National Register of Historic Places, facing pushback at nearly every turn. Think about that. 100 years later, and the people who own this ground still control how much of its history gets uncovered. Local families who lost relatives in that battle still don't know the exact number of dead, let alone where all of them rest. Some believe entire sections of unmarked graves sit beneath what's now private mining land, completely inaccessible to researchers or descendants. That's not folklore. That's a documented, ongoing dispute happening right now, in real time. And it's far from the only cemetery in these mountains where the people in charge decided silence was easier than the truth. Number 5, Cemeteries 6 and 7. Silence like that shows up again and again once you start looking for it, especially in the coal fields that dot these hills. Nuttleburg, West Virginia, once housed hundreds of families working one of the most productive coal mines in the New River Gorge. Henry Ford even bought a stake in the operation during the 1920s, hoping to secure a steady coal supply for his auto plants. For a few decades, the town had a school, a church, a company store, and rows of homes stacked up the hillside. Then the coal ran out. Nuttleburg emptied almost overnight in the 1950s, and families scattered across the region looking for new work. Nobody organized the move of the town's cemetery. Headstones stayed exactly where they were, and the forests simply grew around them. Walk those grounds today, and you'll find sunken plots half swallowed by rhododendron and pine. Some markers list names and dates clearly enough to read. Others have worn completely smooth, erased by a century of rain and root growth. The National Park Service now maintains the site, but even their own records admit gaps. Several burials referenced in old company ledgers don't match any marked grave still standing. Picture walking that hillside in October, leaves crunching underfoot, and realizing the ground beneath you dips slightly every few feet. Each dip is a grave nobody mapped. A similar story plays out 60 miles north at an even smaller site near the old Leyland mining camp. In 1915, an explosion inside the Leyland mine killed 112 men in a matter of seconds, one of the deadliest disasters in the state's coal history. Many victims were buried in a hillside cemetery above the camp within days, before families from out of state could even arrive to claim their dead. Company records from that period have mostly disappeared, lost or destroyed when the mine closed decades later. Genealogists trying to trace victims today often hit dead ends, relying on old newspaper clippings instead of official burial logs. Descendants have spent years petitioning for a proper memorial listing every name. So far, nobody's built one. 2 towns, 2 disasters, and 1 shared problem. Entire communities buried without anyone keeping a full account of who's actually there. That absence follows us straight into our next stop, where the missing records weren't lost by accident at all. Number 6, Cemeteries 8 and 9. Deliberate record destruction sounds like an exaggeration until you look at what happened near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the early 1940s. The federal government needed land fast to build the West Virginia Ordnance Works, a massive TNT plant meant to supply the war effort. Officials seized roughly 8,000 acres almost overnight, displacing entire farming communities with barely any warning. Families who'd lived on that land for generations got mere days to pack up their homes and move on. Buried loved ones posed a bigger problem. Dozens of small family cemeteries sat scattered across the seized land, some containing graves over a century old. The government promised relocation services, offering to move remains to new burial sites elsewhere in the county. Records show hundreds of graves were indeed moved during that frantic window, but not all of them. Local historians have documented several cemeteries where relocation crews simply ran out of time, or funding, or both. Construction crews reportedly poured concrete over sections of ground still containing unmarked graves, prioritizing the plant's wartime deadline over proper burial procedure. No complete list of which graves got left behind has ever surfaced. Stand near the old TNT plant ruins today, and you're standing on top of buried history in more ways than one. Concrete igloos built to store explosives stilled the landscape, cracked and covered in vines. Somewhere beneath that same ground, forgotten families rest in graves the government never fully accounted for. This is also, notably, the exact area where witnesses later reported sightings of a strange winged figure with glowing red eyes, starting in November 1966. Most people know that story as the Mothman. Fewer connect it to the land's darker, quieter history, a place where the dead were displaced by force and never properly resettled. Researchers who study the sightings note something locals rarely mention outright. Nearly every reported encounter happened within a few miles of those disturbed burial grounds. Coincidence? Maybe. But it's the kind of coincidence that keeps people out of those woods after dark, whether they believe in winged creatures or not. 2 cemeteries, 1 government project, and 1 unanswered question hanging over both. How many families are still waiting to find out where their relatives actually ended up? Number 7. Cemetery 10 Plus Synthesis. That unanswered question about missing families leads to the final site on this list, and it might be the strangest one of all. Scattered through the mountains of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, unmarked graves still surface along old routes tied to the Cherokee removal of 1838, an event most people know as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died along those forced marches from exposure, illness, and exhaustion. Soldiers buried the dead quickly wherever they fell, often without ceremony, without markers, and without recording exact locations. Modern construction projects occasionally uncover remains near these old routes, sometimes decades apart, sometimes without warning. When that happens, work typically stops for archaeological review, but by then the burial site has usually sat undisturbed and unmarked for close to 2 centuries. No comprehensive map exists showing every grave connected to the forced march through this region. Historians estimate the true number could run into the thousands. You're walking a quiet forest trail in the Smokies right now, unaware that the ground beneath your boots may hold someone who never made it home. That's not a legend. That's a documented historical reality still being uncovered today, 1 construction project at a time. 10 cemeteries. 10 different reasons the dead went unrecorded. A rushed doctor's exam started it, followed by a courthouse fire that erased decades of records. Land disputes outlived the people who started them. Wartime deadlines mattered more than burial records. Forced marches were never fully documented in the first place. Here's the pattern connecting every single one. It's never really about ghosts. It's about paperwork that vanished, land that changed hands, and communities that got erased faster than anyone could write their names down. Locals don't avoid these places after sunset because they're superstitious. Because something in each of these grounds still feels unfinished, unresolved, waiting for an answer nobody's given yet. Every grave without a name represents a promise broken somewhere along the way, a person nobody came back for. That's the real reason people in these hills lower their voices when these places come up in conversation, even generations later. The mountains remember, even when the records don't. And that's exactly why 1 cemetery on this list still isn't marked on any official map at all. That unmarked cemetery still doesn't have a name, a location, or a single official record. Local historians are still searching. Appalachia holds hundreds more stories like these, buried and waiting. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the next forgotten place these mountains have been hiding.